name is Eric Banks. I'm the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Uli Baer and Jane Tylis, the faculty co-directors of the Center for the Humanities, who are co-sponsoring tonight's event. It would be a terrific event to host either Greg or Tim for a conversation about his respective work, but tonight we're extremely lucky and honored to have hit the daily double of political and foreign policy infamy with a program dedicated to new books on both Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger by two of our most distinguished historians and journalists. Both of their books, Kissinger's Shadow, The Long Reach of America's Most Controversial Statesman, and One Man Against the World, The Tragedy of Richard Nixon, have appeared in recent months. And both are extremely timely, even if the events that they cover largely took place more than 4 decades past. A mathematical phrase that Tim mentioned to me a moment ago when I spoke to him, the Venn diagram, comes to mind as an extremely apt way to describe the event this evening, and I'm extremely happy to welcome them both. I also want to take a minute to thank some of the people who helped put together tonight's event. From the Center for the Humanities, Gwyneth Mallon, the executive director, has been instrumental in helping us not only with this event, but to come together to co-sponsor a number of public events where our interests intersect. And so it's really always wonderful to work with everyone at the Center for the Humanities. And I want to thank also Denny Valentine for her work on this, and Victor Bautista, who's our pinch hitter videographer this evening. And on our side at the New York Institute for the Humanities, Melanie Rehak and Stephanie Steicher have been instrumental in helping to put this event together tonight. Also the publicists at Henry Holt and Metropolitan Books, Tracy Locke and Carolyn O'Keefe, who I'm not sure if they're here tonight or not. But
Carolyn's.
Well, I see you back there. Hi, Carolyn. We really appreciate all your help. Many of you probably learned about this event thanks to The Nation. And I want to just say thanks to Peter Rothberg, who I don't know if he's here this evening or not, but he was extremely helpful in helping us to get out the word. And it's wonderful to see you all here. I'm looking forward to our conversation very much. I want to remind you that the books are for sale in the lobby with a 20% discount. So if you haven't had the chance yet to purchase a book, I hope you'll take the time to do so afterwards. And we also will have a brief reception following our conversation that I hope you'll also join us for. And finally, let me just remind you that it'd be great if you could turn off your cell phone. We're extremely fortunate to welcome as our moderator tonight one of the most esteemed historians of foreign policy, Marilyn Young. Marilyn B. Young came to NYU from the University of Michigan in 1980 and has taught there ever since. She is perhaps best known for her work on the Vietnam War, and the title that I'll give you is The Vietnam Wars, 1945 to 1990, and has written as well on U.S.-China relations and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Her most recent publication is a collection of essays co-edited with Yuki Tanaka, One Wishes Henry Kissinger Had Read, which is titled Bombing Civilians, A 20th Century History. So I'll now turn the mic over to Marilyn. She'll introduce
He didn't have
our
to
panelists.
read it, he did it.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and to introduce in turn the people to my right. First, Tim Weiner, who is the author of 5 books, including the one just mentioned, the New York Times bestseller, One Man Against the World, The Tragedy of Richard Nixon, and Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA, which won the National Book Award in 2007. Tim has won the Pulitzer Prize over the course of his 30 years as a newspaper reporter. He adds, I solicited this bio, that his mother was born at the same time and in the same town as Henry Kissinger. Tim is currently teaching at Princeton as the Anschutz Distinguished Fellow in American Studies, a course I very much wish I could take, entitled The CIA in Fact and Fiction. Grandin is the author of a number of prize-winning books. In fact, he is the despair of his colleagues because he is so productive, including most recently Kissinger's Shadow. Not long before his book on Kissinger, he wrote The Empire of Necessity, Slavery, Freedom, and Deception in the New World, which won the Bancroft Prize in American History. He is also the author of Fordlandia, The Rise and Fall of Henry Ford's Forgotten Jungle City, published by Metropolitan Books in 2009, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History, as well as for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. He's written a number of other books, and while not a journalist like Tim, he has published in the New York Times, Harper's, the London Review, The Nation, the Boston Review, the LA Times, and last but not least, the American Historical Review, sorry. He has also made numerous television appearances, on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Program, and, in my view, for his sins, The Charlie Rose Show. Before I open this with questions for the two of them, I want to read to you just a little bit from Tim's book. It's on page 141, to give you, or to remind you, and those of you who are too young to know, sort of the flavor of these two men we'll be talking about. "We will bomb the bejesus out of them," Nixon told Kissinger on November 20th, 1972. "To hell with history, just knock the shit out of them." This is a direct quote, I'm not being... "That's the best. I had not thought of that," Kissinger said. "Do they realize that they have to deal with here a man who, if he wins the election, will kick the shit out of them, and if he loses the election, will do it even more?" Nixon went on, his voice becoming more and more forceful. "Did that ever occur to you?" I have to say honestly, it did not," Kissinger replied in a tone more admiring than aghast. "I'd finish off the goddamn place," Nixon said, "knock the shit out of them, and then everybody would say, 'Oh, horrible, horrible, horrible.'" And he laughed with pleasure at the thought. So those are the two guys. So the two of you have just added to the very substantial number of books already published about Kissinger, about Nixon, and about the two of them as a duo. Indeed, the first volume of Neil Ferguson's 1,000-page biography of Kissinger, the first volume, I want to underline, has its official publication date today. Now, apart from the considerable pleasure of writing about these two disturbing individuals, what did you have in mind when you decided to write a book about them? What would you most like readers to understand about them? And if you were reading your own books, pencil in hand, assuming you're the sort of miscreant like me who marks up their books, what would you underline in your own books, in each other's books? So, Tim, do you want to start, and then Greg?
Well, let's talk about how these two men got together. And I would also like to point out to you, although I did not know that Greg was writing a book about Kissinger, nor, I think, did you know that I was writing a book about Nixon, there is a sentence in each book that is virtually identical, which is that both men thought history was a tragedy. Nixon was born on the edge of Western civilization in Orange County, California, in a little town called Yorba Linda. I was just there a couple weeks ago. In 1913, his parents, a pious Irish Quaker and a very angry, drunken greengrocer with a sixth grade education, and possibly the only man in Orange County who could not make a go of it growing oranges, named each of their 5 sons after British kings. President Richard Nixon was the only one who made a go of his life. He did not have an auspicious beginning. He did win a scholarship to the newly opened Duke Law School, from which he graduated in 1937. He applied for a job at the FBI. They never wrote back. He applied to a lot of prestigious white shoe New York law firms. They wouldn't have him. He went back with his tail between his legs to Orange County, California, to the town next door, Whittier, where he'd gone to college. And basically did not make a go of it as a lawyer. He did wills, trusts, divorces. He hated it all. He was commissioned a Navy lieutenant, spent his time in the war essentially as a glorified clerk in Bougainvillea. The most dangerous thing that occurred to him would have been a coconut falling on his head. And then he went home, and a committee of Republican leaders in Orange County were casting about for someone to run against a congressman named Jerry Voorhis, who was a liberal Democrat and very pro-labor, and Nixon kicked the bejesus out of Jerry Voorhis. Then he moved up the scale and went after the liberal senator from California, Helen Gahagan Douglas, who was married to Mervyn Douglas, the Hollywood actor, who was in fact something of a lefty. And he kicked the bejesus out of Helen Gahagan Douglas and became a senator. 2 years later, he was Eisenhower's vice president. 8 years after that, he lost by 117,000 votes to John F. Kennedy in an election which may or may not have been stolen. In Illinois, where the graveyards voted that night, and in southern Texas, where JFK's running mate LBJ held a considerable amount of political sway over county commissioners who counted the votes. People think he spent the next years wandering in the wilderness. He wasn't wandering in the wilderness. He went to, I need to quote this, one of his National Security Council aides, William Watts, said later, in those years in limbo, he traveled around the world and he lined up delegates. His time in the U.S. was spent going to every graduation, bar mitzvah, christening ceremony for every Republican potential delegate he could. He lined up votes all over the country. It was an incredible job that he did. The other side was that he traveled all over the world and met everybody. Another squeaker of an election in 1968, Nixon barely eked out a victory over LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey. There was considerable skullduggery involved in the last month of that election. I think I'll let Greg tell you about that and tell you how Nixon and Kissinger came to meet after the election.
Well, thanks, and it's great to be here with Marilyn and Tim. It's and to talk about Nixon and Kissinger, pretty fascinating historical characters. I must admit that when I started writing about Kissinger, it was more of an abstraction, trying to think through the current national security state and its deep roots and thinking about Kissinger. What actually drove me to it was seeing a photo of Samantha Power and Henry Kissinger at a Yankee Red Sox game, bantering as if they were a geopolitical Tracy and Hepburn, about realism. The realist likes the Yankees, the idealist likes the Red Sox, the underdog, and it just drove me so over the edge that that I originally thought I was going to write I had originally proposed writing a people's obituary of Henry Kissinger, kind of preemptive obituary, with the idea that all of the other obituaries are already on file and ready to go, and this would be an anticipatory one. But I didn't have the writing skill to pull off that level of snark for a whole book, and I got drawn deeper and deeper into Kissinger. I do want to say that he started off as an abstraction, but then he lives not far from here, and he's still alive. And it's what's shocking about Kissinger is how many people have stories about Kissinger. Like how many academics or people of our cultural class, habitus, have some Kissinger story. They ran into him, he did something, they confronted him, or they didn't confront him. It's kind of amazing. I'm sure half of the people in this room have some Kissinger story that they could tell of some interaction, and that was kind of fun as the book came to a conclusion. Kissinger came from the other direction, not from Orange County, but from Bavaria, a small town in Bavaria, Fürth. He was born in 1923. What year did you say Nixon was born? Or was it
1913?
1913. So Kissinger was born in 1923, and German Jewish refugee families got out before Kristallnacht came to Washington Heights in New York, and then he. What's interesting about Kissinger, I think, and one of the reasons why he's so familiar, is that he was he was a product of a kind of post-war meritocracy. He was able to take advantage of the democratization offered by the military, by World War II. He worked his way up. He wound up in Harvard on the GI Bill in 1950, the largest class in Harvard. And he was drawn to history and politics. And one of the quotes the quote that Marilyn started with, that I guess that was Nixon who said, "Don't give a damn about history." What was the quote?
Yeah.
That's Nixon.
Yeah, that's Nixon. But Kissinger basically agreeing with him. And I guess that would be the takeaway. I think Kissinger is misrecognized as a realist and a practitioner of realpolitik. And if you actually go back to his writings, starting with this undergraduate thesis, a 400-page meditation on Spengler,
which Greg had the sitzfleisch to read.
Honestly, it goes through Spengler, Toynbee, and Kant. I really only read the Kant and Spengler sections. I couldn't actually bring myself to read the Toynbee section. And Kissinger is really, he is a product of the undergrad. The thesis was it seemed very familiar. It was like reading Sartre or something. In the 1950s, there was a lot of that kind of. History is not. There's no determination to history. It's open. History is tragedy. It's suffering. There's no meaning to history. But then we can act and intervene in the world and expand
and cause more tragedy on our enemies.
Our range, right. And that would be the takeaway of the book. Is that I think that in the misrecognition of Kissinger as a realist and a realpolitik is a misrecognition of the U.S. national security state, and it explains a lot. And I don't think Kissinger, just to complain a little bit about some reviews, I don't think Kissinger caused the national security state. I don't think it's not a devil's theory of war. I don't think he's singly I don't think if you were to extract history, Kissinger from U.S. history, you would have a virtuous republic. I think that in many ways the same contours would be there, but I think he's illuminating and he's illustrative. He established himself as a right-wing, very hawkish defense intellectual that in the 1950s and early 60s that was constantly critiquing the administration from a kind of, we have to restore meaning and purpose to our foreign policy. We have to Eisenhower and Robert McNamara know that we can project power, but we've forgotten why we are projecting power. And I think that's a recurrent critique from every generation throws up a new cohort of militarists that critique the current administration from those terms. And Kissinger was that in the 1950s, specifically advocated for limited nuclear war and small wars in peripheral areas as a way of breaking the all or nothing impasse of Eisenhower's nuclear deterrence strategy. And he also became an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller, basically the center of the political establishment, a liberal Republican. And what's interesting about Kissinger, and I think what's particular to him, but also exemplary, is with every lurch to the right in American politics, Kissinger lurched with it. He went from Rockefeller to Nixon, Nixon to Reagan, Reagan to the neocons, and you could just plot a trajectory of the contours of American militarism by plotting Kissinger's life. Kissinger was in despair after Nixon won the 1968 nomination from Rockefeller in the Republican nomination, and he was even more in despair when he watched from Martha's Vineyard with Richard Holbrooke the Democrats tearing themselves apart in Chicago. He thought that the center of American politics was evaporating, and with it his chance of having a say. And that despair was very fleeting and lasted about a day.
Because no matter who got elected in 1968, whether it was Nixon or Humphrey, Kissinger would have been the national security advisor to either man. He had manipulated himself. In poker, we call this playing both ends against the middle. And he had made himself invaluable to both camps, but more valuable to Nixon.
And specifically, something you're probably going to hear about a lot with that big biography by he who shall not be named, who makes the case. I mean, Kissinger, it's fairly established that Cy Hirsch made the case, and his source was Richard Allen, Nixon's national security, not a national security advisor, but advisor for national security matters. That Kissinger used his contacts in the Democratic Party to get information about the Paris peace talks, passed it on to Nixon, which
Using Holbrooke.
Using Holbrooke and other people in Paris in order to pass the information on to Nixon, and then Nixon, through a third party, Anna Chennault, basically sent the word to South Vietnam to scotch any deal because they would get a better deal if Nixon was president. And it was it was a close race. Who knows if this made a difference? But Nixon won. It's fairly well established, including by Nixon, by Kissinger, by other people, that Kissinger
and by Lyndon Baines Johnson, the President of the United States.
Who would not, however, make it public.
But the point is, sorry.
The point is that Kissinger would have been the national security advisor no matter what.
Right. And you're going to and why this is important is because it sets the terms for what comes next after sabotaging the Paris peace talks. Nixon and Kissinger come to power, having to restart the Paris peace talks because they promised everybody had to get out of the war. And so, but how do you couldn't, for different reasons, you couldn't start immediately bombing North Vietnam, so they started bombing Cambodia in secret for 5 years, and 100,000 civilians dead. And by the time the war or U.S. involvement in the war ended in 1973, it did on pretty much the terms that were on the table in 1968.
Kissinger, through his direct contacts with Nixon's campaign manager and future Attorney General John Mitchell, who wound up in federal prison for almost 4 years for his acts committed while in office, he was the go-between. Kissinger funneled enough secret information from the Paris peace talks for Nixon, Mitchell, and Anna Chennault, also known as the Dragon Lady. She was Chinese and the widow of Claire Chennault, who established the CIA's civil air transport, their airline in Indochina. Civil air transport, yes. And Nixon and Mitchell got word to the South Vietnamese ambassador in Washington, don't cut a deal. This is now October, the week before the election. We will do better by you. Hold out. And they sent this word to the president of South Vietnam, Thieu. And LBJ knew this because the NSA had the presidential palace in Saigon wired, and the FBI had the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington wired. So LBJ is getting real-time information on this, and he says on tape, because he recorded all of his phone calls, it didn't start with Nixon, this is treason.
It was.
This is treason. At minimum, it was a violation of the Logan Act, one of the oldest statutes on the books, saying that private citizens can't do diplomacy on behalf of the United States. Well, this was not the case. So Nixon wins. Kissinger and Nixon had met once and had casual cocktail party chatter at a Christmas party in 1967. Small talk was not Richard Nixon's strong suit. But when they had a 3-hour meeting at the President-elect Nixon's Pierre Hotel Command Suite, Nixon wrote years later, I had a strong intuition about Henry Kissinger. The combination was unlikely. The grocer's son from Whittier and the refugee from Hitler's Germany, but Nixon recognized a kindred spirit. Throughout Nixon's presidency, Nixon was the grand strategist and Kissinger the tactician. Henry Kissinger didn't make American foreign policy. He helped shape it by carrying out Nixon's strategies. And together, they set out to destroy and recreate the entire foreign policy architecture of the United States of America, to break and remake the Pentagon, to break and remake the CIA, to break and remake the the State Department, and to bend all the instruments of American power to their will, so that these two men, not the Secretary of Defense, not the Secretary of State, and certainly not the Director of Central Intelligence, would have a hand or even knowledge of their war plans in Indochina or their grand strategies vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and China. And on this matter, we have the authority, which I have marked here somewhere, of Richard Helms, who I knew quite well when I was covering CIA for the New York Times, and who is actually a pretty decent human being. Nixon never trusted anyone, said Richard Helms. He said this to me in 1995. He was constantly telling people that the Air Force in their bombings in Vietnam couldn't hit their own ass with their hand, that the State Department was just a bunch of pinstriped cocktail-drinking diplomats, and the CIA couldn't come up with a winning victory or strategy for victory in Vietnam. The president's harangues went on and on and on. They are stupid, they are dumb, they can't do this, and they can't do that. And these same generals, spy masters, admirals, and ambassadors were America's point men in an impossible war. Nixon and Kissinger seize power through secrecy and deception, and this begins very early in 1969 after Nixon's inaugurated. And now, why don't you tell us about the menu?
The menu. Well, there's obviously a lot of things that they do with that seizing of power, and one is in March 1969 is that they start bombing Cambodia for two nominal reasons. One was to disrupt the supply lines and that was coming through Laos and Cambodia, and the other was to perform the madman theory and telegraph to Hanoi that anything was possible and they should get back to the negotiating table. And for a lot of different reasons, they couldn't do this. I mean, Cambodia was a sovereign country. It was a country the U.S. wasn't at war with. The bombing actually started under Johnson, but nowhere near on the scale of Nixon and Kissinger. And so they had to come up with a secret protocol for how to carry out this bombing that took place under the rubric or under the operational name.
Without the knowledge of Congress, and preferably without the knowledge of the Secretary of Defense.
And particularly Congress. Operation Menu was the code name for no reason, as far as I know why they called it Menu. But Kissinger's involvement in Operation Menu and setting it up was again established by Cy Hirsch, not just in his Kissinger survives Watergate, and in the churn of investigations where every aspect is getting investigated. Cambodia, the bombing of Cambodia there was congressional hearings. Investigative journalists began to look into it. Cy Hirsch wrote a few articles about it, but it kind of gets sidelined with Watergate, and as Watergate is transformed mostly into a domestic scandal. And in Cy Hirsch's book in 1983, because people couldn't establish the link between the secret and the double bookkeeping of Operation Menu, which was established in the 1973 congressional hearings on bombings in Cambodia, but they couldn't establish the smoking gun that linked it to Kissinger or the White House. Hirsch did in his 1983 book, The Price of Power, where due to Freedom of Information Acts, he was managed to somehow trace it back to a colonel in the Air Force, Ray Stinton, who Hirsch confronted and got to basically tell him the story, and nobody really followed. And then it was recounted in The Price of Power. Yes, Hirsch's book, The Price of Power. Nobody really followed up on that. One of the things. My book is mostly synthetic. It draws on secondary. But one of the things that I did manage to find was oral history that, as far as I could tell, nobody looked at, with stint that he gave to the Air Force a few months after being confronted by Hirsch in his hotel room. And he says Hirsch got it right. And then he goes on, paragraph after paragraph, through this oral history, talking about how Kissinger, Al Haig, and him on Air Force One, sitting on the runway in Brussels during one of Nixon's first European trips, came up with this double bookkeeping protocol. That the trick was to account for appropriations, to account for fuel, to account for the munitions that we used without tipping off Congress that Cambodia was being bombed. A few congressmen knew about it, including Gerald Ford, I think, but none of the Senate committees knew about this, and none of the appropriations committees knew about it. And Kissinger was instrumental. And what's interesting about Stinton's description and his oral history is how micromanaging Kissinger was about the bombing.
We have an even better real-time account of how this took shape. On February 19th, 1969, Nixon and Kissinger are going off on a grand tour of Europe to meet Charles de Gaulle and other great statesmen. And my hero, kind of anti-hero, but the thing is, everything he ever wrote was accurate, and it's almost 1 million words. Bob Haldeman, the president's chief of staff, was on the plane. Okay. Kissinger told the president, this is February 19th, 1 month into the administration, how the menu attacks would be carried out and how they could be concealed. 4 days later, they're sitting on the tarmac, and the president ordered, ready to depart for Europe. The president orders Kissinger to put the menu plan, the secret bombing of Cambodia, into motion and to keep it secret. They're sitting on Air Force One, parked on the tarmac at the Brussels airport. Nixon goes off to lunch to meet the King and Queen of Belgium. Haldeman stays on the plane. The plans that Kissinger explained to the president that they were, quote, so secret at the time that I was afraid to say anything, Haldeman wrote in his personal diary. I felt I was entering an entire new world. Kissinger told Nixon in writing that in order to set the stage for a covert attack and clear the books on this matter, a routine request for a B-52 strike on a communist target in South Vietnam would serve as a cover for a menu strike in Cambodia. The pilots and the navigators, but not the rest of the crew, would receive secret orders from ground controllers in the American embassies in Laos and Cambodia, vectoring them into their targets in the Cambodia. And on the bomber's return, 2 sets of flight reports would be filed, 1 true and 1 false. 15
finish, and then I got a
Okay.
question.
15 years ago, Bill Clinton became the first American president since Nixon to visit Vietnam, and he made public an Air Force database that had been secret since it was begun in March 1969. Between March 69 and August 73, America dropped 2,756,272 tons of bombs on Cambodia. That figure is 5 times greater than had been previously known, and far exceeds the tonnage of all Allied bombing during World War II, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Kissinger wrote that the decision was one that Nixon could never avow.
And one of the most chilling things, I'll let Marilyn ask a question, but quickly, one of the most chilling things in the Haldeman diary is when the first bombing took place in Cambodia, and I think Kissinger was having a one-on-one with Halperin, Morton Halperin, and somebody came in and handed the note to Kissinger that the bombing happened, there was excess, and Haldeman just, I think it was Kissinger smiled.
Yeah.
It's just I think Jesus wept.
No, my question is, it was no secret to the Cambodians that they were being bombed. And there must have been reporters somewhere in their neighborhood, or at least in Phnom Penh, who could get a rumor that something was falling from the skies.
The way this was first uncovered was not by the U.S. Congress or not by a whistleblower, but by a radio reporter named Silvana Foa, who later became a spokeswoman at the United Nations. And there were two Senate investigators running around trying to figure out what the hell was going on, because there were rumors that the secret bombing is going on. And Silvana Foa turned on her AM radio and said, "Listen to this," and turned it to a frequency. And there were, on open mics that were picked up on her her $5 transistor radio, the communications between the ground controllers in the Cambodian embassy and the pilots in the air. And the two Senate investigators went back and told their boss, Senator Fulbright, "You're not going to believe this one." They believed in a ton.
But to Marilyn's point about what Cambodia knew, actually that bombing in Cambodia, the bombing of Cambodia Senate hearings, there's a published thing. They actually reproduced a FIBIS, Foreign Broadcast Information Service, from March 26, 1969, that they picked up from Cambodia, that made it clear that broadcasting on Cambodia radio was this is March 26, 1969, the same within a few days of the starting of the bombing. The Cambodian population living in the border region has been bombed and strafed almost daily by U.S. aircraft, and the number of people killed as well as material destruction continues to grow. There have been many attacks in recent weeks, causing losses to the Cambodian people. List of victims is getting longer and longer, and then it's ongoing. So this was broadcast on Cambodia radio in March 26, 1969.
But it didn't make headlines here.
On May 9th, 1969, there was a front page story in the New York Times by a very good reporter named William Beecher. Very carefully worded reports stating that B-52s had struck several of the enemy's camps inside Cambodia. There was no public outcry over this. What was really happening, which was a massive attack on a neutral nation concealed by falsified Pentagon reports, didn't come out till 1973. But when a mention that B-52s had struck inside the Cambodia border was on the front page of the New York Times, the nation didn't flip out. The people of America didn't flip out. Henry Kissinger flipped way out.
Right.
And he told Nixon and he told J. Edgar Hoover that the Times story was extraordinarily damaging and dangerous. And Kissinger said to J. Edgar Hoover that he hoped that Hoover would help him, Kissinger, destroy whoever did this, quote unquote. Okay. And that the way to do this was by wiretapping members of the National Security Council staff, American diplomats, and newspaper reporters. And this is really the genesis of the story of Watergate.
Watergate and Kissinger's role in Watergate. Kissinger's
role.
And I think it was Haldeman to make me earlier. Henry cranked Nixon up, and Nixon cranked Kissinger up, and next thing you know, and Kissinger was very astute at keying his description of Daniel Ellsberg, and the Pentagon Papers to play into all of Nixon's many insecurities. Right. He painted him as some kind of Promethean Superman, that was promiscuous and perverse and liberal. And my favorite line is when in the transcripts is when Kissinger tells Nixon, he married a very rich girl. And you could just imagine the resentment and
whose surname was Marx. Not Groucho, not Karl, but the Marx toy company.
Why I think to step back a second and think what obviously we could talk more about Cambodia and more about the effect on the unraveling of the domestic consensus, and I just want to just draw it back to why I think that this is important in understanding the current moment. When Kissinger's book was out last year, World Order, and he was on book tour, he was nobody really. I mean, nobody's challenging him anymore. He's gotten away with it. There were a few reporters, including Todd Zillich in On Point, or no, The Takeaway on NPR, and he pushed Kissinger on Cambodia, and he pushed Kissinger on Chile, and his answer was remarkable. To justify Cambodia, he pointed to Obama's drone program. And to justify Chile, he pointed to the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya and the intent to overthrow Assad in Syria. So in some ways, it's perverse, right? So Kissinger, and it does capture something about the merry-go-round of U.S. justifications, where Kissinger is pointing to today, is invoking today's endless wars to justify what he did 40 years ago, but what he did 40 years ago in some ways made possible today's endless wars. Right. There is a circularity, but Kissinger's not necessarily wrong. All of the implied justifications for Cambodia, whenever Kissinger's had to just defend what he did in Cambodia, he says, America, we were being attacked. It was a haven for enemies. We were rooting out enemy sanctuaries. And so what is sovereignty in relationship to that objective? And that argument was so far out of the mainstream in 1969 and 1970 that a number of fairly establishment defense intellectuals, including Kissinger's colleagues, Thomas Schelling and other people, marched down to Washington and said, enough is enough. Cambodia is a sovereign country. And they were just talking about the invasion. They weren't even talking about the bombing because they didn't know about the bombing. But fast forward 4 decades, and that rationale is a now accepted part of international law. It's what
as is the national surveillance state.
Obama says that the authorization to use military force is based on the need to root out enemy sanctuaries, and
they're everywhere.
So Kissinger's not. It's perverse and it's revealing. But that's the trajectory I was trying to get at in the book.
Let me now open it to the audience. We have some time left, so questions.
We've barely gotten out of the spring of
1969.
Just getting started.
We've got to get up to.
Fire away.
Okay, I'll take one on this side over here, please. Yeah?
Is that me?
Yeah, it's you.
I'm struck by the fact that you begin by locating Kissinger on the right and moving progressively right with each move, with each person that comes along. But the way I'm hearing the dialogue in general, I'm trying to find where are the Democrats, where are the liberals, and the story that actually comes through makes it very difficult to, and the continuity. I mean, we can trace the continuity of civilian bombing back to 1944, 45, and Roosevelt and then Truman and H-bomb and so on. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about left and right in this longer trajectory, and where to fit Kissinger.
I mean, I don't think the left and right maps onto the Democrats and Republicans. I mean, I would certainly when it comes to the national security state, I guess this is the way I would think about it. I think that Kissinger came to power. Kissinger and Nixon didn't cause the breakup of the domestic consensus, right?
That had been rather well broken in 1968.
Right, that was well on its way, but they accelerated it. They accelerated with Cambodia. They accelerated bombing Kent State and Jackson State. Kissinger, at the same time, I think what Kissinger and Nixon do is that they leverage that They more than any other past administration, they learn how to leverage that They subordinate foreign policy to leveraging that polarization. So it's not so much that. I mean, obviously, I'm not letting the Democrats off the hook. I mean, McNamara, Johnson, but what I'm trying to track is more of the overt militarism which justifies every lurch to the right. So Kissinger as kind of as a tribune of that, but Kissinger, Nixon was terrified of the right and keeping the Republicans together for the 72 election. And Kissinger was his emissary to the California right, to Bob Hope, to Ronald Reagan. And in a way, Cambodia was about a lot of things, and Laos was about a lot of things, but it was also going to Reagan and saying, you think there's no difference between Nixon and Humphrey, but we wouldn't have had Cambodia, we wouldn't have Laos. So there's ways in which militarism becomes increasingly subordinated to that polarization which begins to happen is both an effective militarism, and then militarism is used to leverage it, which makes it worse. I mean, I certainly wouldn't map on the Democrats and Republicans.
I come at this from a different direction, Greg. Richard Nixon was the first president in 120 years who was elected with a Congress in control, complete control of the opposition party. The Senate and the House were overwhelmingly controlled by Democrats when Nixon was elected. This sets up a system by which policy almost has to be made in secret without the consent of Congress, preferably without the knowledge of the courts, including the Warren Court, which not long thereafter was no longer the Warren Court, but still had a lot of liberals on it. That same court voted 8-zip that in the end Nixon had to give up the tapes. Justice Rehnquist recused himself because he had been part of Nixon's Justice Department. Nixon saw, he not only didn't trust anybody, in the words of Dick Helms, he felt very literally that he was surrounded by enemies. And when, whatever the number was, 325,000 was the estimate at the White House, when 325,000 Americans marched on Washington in November 1969, Nixon literally was encircled by enemies. This was no metaphor. And he never stopped believing that. He trusted no one, and he felt he had very few allies. And one of the only people in his own inner circle who could always be counted on to say yes to him and then badmouth him behind his back was Henry Kissinger.
They were made for each other. Yes, please.
Greg, you anticipated my question by your glancing references to Laos. I've always wondered why Cambodia was such a scandal and Laos was almost never mentioned in the same context, although it seems to me that the actions were equally illegal, equally clandestine, and yet Laos, I mean, we were in Laos last year and we're told that more bombs were dropped on Laos than all the bombs were dropped in World War II on both sides. Why is it never mentioned?
I know I got posted. Of course, helped me with some of the research, and that was one of the questions I asked him to confirm. That befuddled me, that question. Why Cambodia and not Laos? I think Cambodia because it was the entryway into South Vietnam more than Laos is pretty.
No, actually, Laos. The trail ran through Laos.
I know
it had run through Laos from the
but
almost
why
from the start.
why Operation Menu was targeting Cambodia? Why Cambodia becomes
They'd already
and
bombed Laos to pieces.
No, Laos
Johnson had.
Laos was the CIA's war.
The CIA's war, and Cambodia was Nixon.
Was the Pentagon's.
So is the question of why were they obsessed with Cambodia? Or why is the scandal more about Cambodia than why outrage isn't about Laos?
The latter question. And to call it the CIA's war would suggest that Kissinger and Nixon had very little to do with it, which I'm sure was not the case.
Well,
Right.
Let me try and find the passage that might explain this.
Why more outrage about Cambodia and not Laos? It's a good question. I think it has to do with that fact that they did. Laos wasn't bombed in secret. I mean, I think that Congress. Cambodia, for some reason, all the reasons we talked about, were that Operation Menu, that specific protocol, that double bookkeeping. We're pretending we're sending the planes to South Vietnam, but we're really going into Cambodia. We're going to burn all the documents in the furnace that we have. All of that insanity, that high deceit was Cambodia. That didn't obtain to Laos. I think Laos was no, but I don't think journalists. What's that? Right.
Well,
But also the cover-up, there was a complete cover-up on what was going on in Laos. And Henry Kissinger made sure of it. The fact that the war in Laos was conducted largely by the CIA did not mean that it was conducted in secret. CIA personnel were dying there. Air Force personnel were dying there. Special ops soldiers were dying there. Okay. The following conversation took place 1 year into the Nixon administration. Okay. The president asks, where do we stand on Laos? The Secretary of State says, we're heading for a serious problem. A replay and escalation is occurring. Our sorties have doubled. B-52 strikes have taken place. The Secretary of State, Bill Rogers, says, we have refused to make anything public. How can I defend keeping this secret? Attorney General Mitchell says, well, that just opens Pandora's box, going to Congress. And Nixon says, we must lay it out. We must write it in a simple way. There's a lot of confusion on this. I don't want any questions left. Kissinger tries to explain to Nixon, after this National Security Council meeting breaks up, that it would be extremely difficult to lay it out in a simple way because of the long and deadly history of U.S. covert operations in Laos. Nixon waved him off. He said, we won't mention that, he said to Kissinger. We'll have to fuzz the capacity. Non-combative and none killed. And in March 1970, Nixon releases a white paper on Laos, every word vetted by Kissinger. And there was a phrase in that paper that no American had ever been killed in combat in Laos over the previous 20 years. That was a complete and utter falsehood, okay? And the responsibility for that ultimately lay with Nixon, who wanted to fuzz the issue, but more with Kissinger, who knew better. Kissinger told Haldeman 3 days later, I knew it wasn't true. The president should never have made that statement. The truth was that at the time that American casualties in Laos never mentioned the Laotians and the Hmong warriors who were fighting alongside the Americans. The U.S. casualties in Laos were 300. And the President of the United States said there were none.
No, but the question was, why didn't
Why the
Laos
outrage?
register?
And I think there's three. Do you have an answer?
Sorry? This is Tom Grunfeld, who teaches at SUNY Empire State.
One of the things is the American media really didn't pay attention to Laos. There was very little interest in Laos.
Very hard to get in.
Well, no, that's not true.
No,
there
that
was a
isn't
journal
true at
called
all.
the Far
Fred
Eastern
Rathman was
Economic
there.
Review in Hong Kong, which always had a reporter in Vientiane
That's right.
who was reporting on this. It was an obscure journal for most Americans, but there was reporting. Al McCoy's book on politics and heroin of Southeast Asia came out. The war was still on, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And he got into Long Chen, which was the CIA base. He had a photograph of it. But it got almost no recognition in this country in the media.
But that
so-
doesn't.
So they just
No,
Yeah,
but
it's just the
his
question.
question is, how come?
How come?
My answer to that is the United States had been involved in Laos since the 1960s, that there was a civil war there, that
Since the
the
50s.
idea that the communists were going to take over Laos and that had to be stopped was the ruling understanding of what was happening in Laos. At the same time, Cambodia had Sihanouk, and until he got overthrown, Cambodia wasn't an issue in the American consciousness at that time. So Laos had been around for a while, and the obscuring and the
Lying.
lying and the distortion of what was going on in Laos had been going on for long enough so that when the Plain of Jars is actually bombed, and the casualties are mind-boggling, the general impression in the United States is, well, Plain of Jars, nobody lives there. I mean, it just sounded like it was empty space. And nobody but Fred Bramfman and the Far Eastern Economic Review paid any attention at all, which is why the American public, maybe it's why the American public didn't respond, but why the American public responded as it did and how it did is a much more complicated question.
And why?
Altogether.
And why today, when people are listing Kissinger's war crimes,
They don't
people
list
know about
Laos.
Cambodia, but Laos. I think part of it has to do with William Shawcroft's book, and the Khmer Rouge and the genocide, and the way in which Kissinger's cause
right.
of the bombing leads to the effect of the genocide. I think that's something that's
Yeah, I think that's part
that's
of it too.
the scale of the travesty, and I mean the scale of the destruction in Cambodia, and the Shawcroft book, I think, establishing the connection, which Kissinger has been arguing against. Kissinger has been defending himself from since it was published. I mean, he's constantly arguing with that book in every memoir that he writes.
But also, Nixon ordered the president of South Vietnam to invade Laos, and this was a very public mission, supported by U.S. Helicopters,
Long Son.
tanks.
That was in
Right.
the media. That was
Okay, and that was a big deal.
That
And
was
it
a big
also
deal.
produced one of the most iconic images of all American involvement in Southeast Asia, which is South Vietnamese soldiers clinging desperately to the skids of an American helicopter trying to get out of this hellhole. It was a very short invasion. The South Vietnamese lost 9,000 killed and wounded in 45 days. The Americans, 102 dead, 215 wounded, and 53 missing in action. 92 of those helicopters and 5 fighter jets supporting the invasion were shot down. And in a report to the nation at the conclusion of this operation, there was a New York Times reporter there, a very good one, Gloria Emerson. And she reported interviewing survivors back in South Vietnam. What has dramatically demoralized many of the South Vietnamese troops is the large number of their own wounded who are left behind, begging for their friends to shoot them or to leave them hand grenades so they could commit suicides before the North Vietnamese or the American B-52s killed them. The day after Gloria Emerson reported that, Nixon went on television in an address to the nation saying, "Tonight I can report that Vietnamization has succeeded." Vietnamization was the policy of changing the color of the corpses on the battlefield from Caucasian to Asian.
I think Nixon also told Kissinger, "I don't care what happens, it's a win."
As this evening has been, I think, do we have time for more? A few more questions. Yes, please.
You mentioned in passing that Nixon wanted to reorganize the CIA, and I'm just wondering if
Oh, I didn't. I maybe,
someone
maybe.
said that. Okay,
Tim said that.
you just happen to be looking at me. And I'm wondering. I mean, we have the CIA in the '60s running the Bay of Pigs, probably involved in the Kennedy assassination. I mean, doing these horrendous.
The President of the United States, 2 presidents, one organized it, one authorized it, Eisenhower and Kennedy. The CIA doesn't dream up missions on its own. The President of the United States controls the CIA.
And then from Nixon on, what was the change? That the Church Committee obviously had to address.
What Nixon and Kissinger did was to consolidate every instrument of American foreign policy and military power that they could in their hands, the 2 men's hands. They would order station chiefs without telling the Director of Central Intelligence, Dick Helms. They would command ambassadors without telling the Secretary of State. And they would command generals and admirals without telling the Secretary of Defense, Mel Laird. And this is all down in black and white. You had not merely the constitutional crisis of a president defying the Supreme Court and lower courts as a consequence of Watergate. You had the very thing that we fought the revolution for against the British and their mad king, which is to keep power out of the hands of one or two men who then exercise that power in secret.
So just to follow up on that, do you think that Nixon and Kissinger centralized this authority over military actions by the United States because of their own desire to control things and paranoia? Or was, especially on the part of Kissinger, there really some objection he had to the way in which, for example, the CIA was undertaking covert ops throughout the 1950s under the Dulleses? There's something wrong with that from Kissinger's perspective?
Wait, something wrong with what? I'm sorry. Just
the covert ops, the way in which the CIA, the CIA is, invading sovereign countries and overthrowing governments all over the part. It's part of the basis of the organization.
Right.
Did Kissinger have a problem with that?
No, I don't think. No, I don't know. As far as I know, I don't think Kissinger. Kissinger. One could, and people have focused on Kissinger as a portal into the deep state. I mean, he was deeply involved in that, in military intelligence. Then, then fairly early on, he was on all of these different psych ops committees that were attached to the National Security Council. He was his advisor at Harvard. William Elliott was a Cold Warrior with deep ties. That's a level of detail that less capable and a little bit less interested in. I was more interested in the broad sweeps of how Nixon and although Kissinger and Nixon's personalities are fascinating, I was more interested in how they both preside over the disintegration of the older national security state, which in the book I define as elite planning, bipartisanship, and some public consent, to a new while simultaneously helping to reconstitute a national security, post-Vietnam national security, because they'd able to move forward. That rests ever more on spectacular displays of violence, ever more on covert operations, which you could look at Angola and all of the stuff that Kissinger was doing in Southern Africa under Ford, not Nixon, as a precursor to Iran-Contra, and that leveraging of leveraging of political polarization at home for political advantage using militarism. I think in broad strokes they represent that moment of transformation to what we have today, a state that relies on spectacular acts of violence. And Kissinger himself goes, he supports the first Gulf War, he supports the second Gulf War. The first Gulf War is like a inversion of Cambodia, whereas it's done in the dark, it's done in secret, because they're afraid. I mean, the reason why it has to be done in secret is because they're afraid of public reaction. For one of the reasons why they bombed Cambodia in secret. The first Gulf War, they have months of debate, and then there's these techno displays of power, cable news, and Kissinger is an expert commentator. It is the fulfillment of Kissingerism, and if Kissinger is the opposite, if Kissinger spends most of his time in office trying to make the world conform to how he thinks it should be, because he's constantly complaining about, I'm not going to let a third-rate country, either be Cambodia or North Vietnam, not succumb, not bend to the will of the greatest power in the world. The Gulf War, for a very short moment, the first Gulf War is the completion of Kissinger, in which it seems like we can make a third world tyrant bend to our will. And so you could see that trajectory, and that. So the specifics about the CIA, about the reorganization of the CIA, I'm not really capable.
I have what may be a very naive question. I'm sorry. Is somebody else trying to talk? Should I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Yeah. In 1962, I was taking Gov 180 from Henry Kissinger.
I told you. See, everybody has a story about Henry Kissinger.
He was a thoroughly disliked, as more so than any professor. I'm sorry, thoroughly disliked.
That's great.
Professor hissed regularly, and he was, I think doing some sideline advising to Nelson Rockefeller at the time.
Yeah.
What personal qualities enabled him within 6-7 years to be maneuvering every bureaucracy, the CIA, the Pentagon, the presidency?
Richard Nixon gave him that power.
But he must have had those. He's up against some very tough opponents, and he's outwitting them at every turn.
Nixon is the strategist. Kissinger is the tactician. Throughout all of this, throughout all the war making, throughout all the diplomacy, the talks with China, the talks with the Soviet Union, Kissinger's not making policy. He's trying to execute policy. Even when he doesn't agree with the policy being executed.
But so the take on Kissinger by previous biographers is that he's somehow a jaw to American experience, that he would have been better suited to cabinet diplomacy of the 19th century without the messy interest politics. That's not, it's obviously not true, that he is a product of the post-war meritocracy, and he excelled at being able to remake himself and create himself at different moments to different people. So to Nelson Rockefeller, he was something and this carries through, I think, to this day. He is chameleon-like in his, he's on Stephen Colbert, and he's
reptilian, perhaps.
And I think that is a product. I think he is a quintessential product of post-war meritocracy in all of its forms.
Look what he offered Nixon. He was an intellectual.
He was
a European. His arrogance was bowed only to Nixon himself. He's ideal. Joe Heller wrote a great book in which he talked about how, only he said it was every Texan needs his Jew. Nixon had his Jew, and he thought of him as a Jew as well. And but Nixon was the president. He was the strategist.
Yeah.
Why does Nixon go to China?
Are you asking
a deal entirely orchestrated in secret by Henry Kissinger. Why does Nixon go to Moscow the same year? He's trying to cut deals with the two greatest communist tyrants on the planet to help him get out of Vietnam. Okay. The Shanghai Declaration, which is the only concrete result of the visit to Mao and to Zhou Enlai in 1972, is a totally empty document in which states the U.S. believes this, the Chinese believe that, the U.S. and on and on and on. There's no concord in the Shanghai Declaration. The SALT talks, which were the centerpiece of the Moscow visit, resulted in the greatest buildup of military weaponry in American history. And on this we have the authority of Secretary of Defense Schlesinger. Why? Because Kissinger cleverly left MIRVs, multiple reentry vehicles, where you could put up to 14 warheads on one missile, out of the SALT talks, so that there could be a treaty which resulted in the greatest proliferation of nuclear warheads in modern times. A genius tactician, okay? What Nixon and Kissinger have in alliance, their Venn diagram, if you will, is not simply their sense that history is a tragedy, not simply their covert and conspiratorial minds, okay, but the organizing principle of anti-communism. The only way Nixon felt he could be reelected overwhelmingly, aside from sabotaging every viable Democratic candidate who was running, George McGovern not being a viable candidate, was to win the war, was to get a solution, okay? And he's talking to Kissinger about drawing the sword, okay, and destroying the dikes that irrigated all of North Vietnamese agriculture. And Nixon says, we ought to take the dikes out now. Kissinger replies, that will drown about 200,000 people. I'd rather use a nuclear bomb. Nixon says, have you got that ready? I just want you to think big, Henry. Okay. And then we get to the situation where it's a week before the election, and just like happened in '68, Kissinger engineers a fake diplomacy, okay, and comes to Washington and in a rare public press conference says, "We believe peace is at hand." That was a complete and total lie. And here's what Nixon and Kissinger and Al Haig, who was Kissinger's Kissinger, wrote about that a few years thereafter. Nixon, I knew immediately that our bargaining position with the North Vietnamese would be seriously eroded, and our problem of bringing Thieu and the South Vietnamese along would be made even more difficult. Kissinger, peace is at hand, would provide a handy symbol of government duplicity in the continued bitter atmosphere of the Vietnam debate. And Haig said, the president regarded Kissinger's gaffe as a disaster. Thieu's ambassador comes to see Kissinger, and Kissinger says, your government has managed to enrage the president almost beyond belief. Saigon thinks that clever Kissinger, he wants the Nobel Prize. We will wear him out and we will get to President Nixon. It is a tragedy, Kissinger says to the South Vietnamese ambassador. We have produced a horrible tragedy.
Tim.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the choice of title and subtitle of your book, because reading the book as far as I've gone and hearing the discussion, it seems more like it should be the complete evil of Richard Nixon rather than the tragedy of Richard Nixon.
Hey,
what different possibilities did you go through in terms of choosing a subtitle like that?
I think I just quoted Henry Kissinger saying, we have produced a horrible tragedy. And I think people should see this as a Shakespearean tragedy in which the king destroys himself.
Yeah, but what about the world he's destroying?
Oh.
Who's the tragedy is what he did to everybody else, not him.
Which Nixon?
Nixon?
Either one.
I wanted to call it a people's obituary till the end. Sarah made me call it the Kissinger's shadow.
One of a very close Nixon aide named Bob Finch, campaign manager, cabinet officer, president counselor, said that Nixon believed, quote, it was me against the world. And that's where the title One Man Against the World comes from. Who wins? The world. In the end.
He's not a tragic figure. He's an evil figure.
Well, I think we've gone both from tragedy to farce. So I want to thank Greg, Tim, and Marilyn for such an interesting conversation.